Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Carleton. I'm the director of the Centre for Critical and Creative Writing here at the University of Queensland. Welcome to our final UQ Book Club of the year. You voted at the end of the August session for a Queensland Premier's Literary Award nominee, and we're very happy to oblige by bringing you Melanie Myers and her engrossing debut novel, Meet Me at Lennon's. Before I introduce Melanie to you, I would like to commence by acknowledging the Jagera and the Turrbal as the traditional custodians of the beautiful grounds that the University of Queensland is situated upon, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. A reminder too that you are warmly encouraged to actively participate in our conversation today. It is a club, don't be shy, I'd ask you to post your questions and comments in the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom toolbar there, not the chat function. So while there's still a few of you wandering in through the front Zoom door, but we'll move on and I will introduce Melanie. Melanie Myers is a Brisbane-based writer, academic and occasional actor. She has a doctorate of creative arts. Her short fiction and articles have been published in a variety of publications, including Kill Your Darlings, Overland, Arena Magazine, Griffith Review and Beckett. In 2018, she won the Queensland Literary Awards Glendower Award for an Emerging Writer with this novel that we're reading today. And of course, she was nominated this year for the 2020 Courier Mail's People's Choice Award, the Queensland Book of the Year Award, that is, and the award for works of state significance. Terrific CV there, Melanie. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
Good to have you. Melanie has was just telling us that she has moved into a converted church, which is the beautiful kind of background that we're looking at. That's one of the nice things about Zoom. We get to check out each other's paths, right? Just reading through that CV, Melanie, it suddenly struck me that there's quite an alignment of interests between yours and Olivia's CV in the novel. Do you want to talk to us a bit about where you sit within the story, or either within or alongside your central protagonist and her range of interests there?
Sure. Well, I've never felt Olivia was me. She always felt very separate to me. But yes, she has an interest in history and English literature. My background is theatre and drama. So that aspect of the book comes from there, where she's a bit wary of that scene. Yes, but certainly a lot of my interests are in the book, and that's, I think, pretty natural for a first-time novelist. Right? Yep. You know,
Indeed, and feed your passions and curiosities in there. It's like we're following the scent of the novelist's research interests there in really engaging ways. Of all the novels that we've read for the book club this year, this is one that I've found myself recommending to Brisbane friends to kind of share. It only occurred to me in reading the first few chapters of the book that this is the first novel. I've been living in Brisbane for 20 years, and it's the first time that I've been able to map my own geographic and cultural experiences of the city into a book. You know, I read Andrew McGann's West End and Fortitude novels before I moved here, and Nick Earls's books, I think, seem to speak to people who grew up in Brisbane. But it was really lovely to be able to share a central protagonist's journey through those cultural precinct locations, and you know, the Lychee Lounge and the Java Cafe and Paddington Antique Centre. So thank you for bringing us contemporary Brisbane. I wasn't expecting there to be such a firm grounding in contemporary Brisbane. I think I was really expecting this to be very much a historical.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Do you want to talk to us about how you found yourself bringing Brisbane to life in the novel? It almost feels like it's a kind of a character in the novel.
Yeah. Well, Brisbane was always going to be like a character in own right. A little bit of background here. So about, I don't know, mid-2000s, I was living in Sydney trying to do the actor thing. And I sat down because the acting thing wasn't going so well. Anyway, about 2005, I was like, well, I'm going to write a novel. And so I had a real interest in the home front, the World War II home front. So I researched that aspect, but I set this novel in Sydney, and it had a contemporary story and it had a World War II story, and the two, it wasn't a very good novel. It was, it's one of those first novels where you write out, you just do everything wrong because you don't know what you're doing, but your inner critic doesn't exist, so it's fantastic. So when I'd written that novel, I still had this burning interest in the home front, but I moved back to Brisbane. I was born in Sydney, I lived on the Sunshine Coast, back to Sydney, back to Brisbane. And I wanted to have another go at the home front novel. And I knew that from my previous research that Brisbane felt the effects of the American friendly invasion far more than any other city. So I knew that, and I just thought, well, I want to write this about Brisbane, my adopted city that I have this weird kind of relationship with. And it just kind of went from there. So I did a lot of site research. I'd walk around the city taking notes of where buildings were, old buildings like the primary building, what would have been there in the 1940s, what's there now, and just wanting to get that sort of sense of past and present Brisbane. And that sense of Brisbane's changed a lot as well.
Mm. It's a city that seems to constantly erase the past and build over it, in ways.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the history too. Brisbane's an adopted city for me as well. And I felt reading this book, I felt a little bit like one of those British characters in those Ian Forster novels, that trudge through Florence with their Baedekers in their hands. Cultural references. I really enjoyed those, and I found myself really pining for a feeling like I missed out on not knowing Lennon's, in all of its kind of green and cream marble glory. It just sounded like a real beacon to good taste, and
place to be in the 1940s.
Yeah, it's great. Well, maybe the people at home will have some of those sorts of questions about, or things that they relate to as well. Maybe people have got some cultural memory of Brisbane in previous decades too, that the book evoked for them. I'll be curious to hear other people's point of contact with the novel and what it was that spoke to you at home. I have to say that coming from a theatre background as well, I very much enjoyed discovering Gloria Gaynor's fictional place amongst the forgotten women playwrights of the 1940s. It's actually an interest of mine and of ours here at UQ. Kerry Kilner at Oxford has been working with us in the drama area precisely on that topic over the past few years, digging up forgotten women playwrights from the wartime and pre and post-war era and digitising them, publishing them with PlayLab. So the novel sits really beautifully.
Oh, wow, yeah. That's fantastic.
Can you talk us through your it sounds like there's a theatrical inroad for you. Can you talk us through your discovery, or your invention, I guess, of Gloria and her peers in that theatre scene of the 1940s? What drew you towards that?
Well, I mean, my own background. So I studied, I did a Bachelor of Theatre Studies at QUT, and then I did the acting course at QUT. So I was kind of this was early sort of 2000s, like 90s. So a lot about Brisbane's theatre scene, put it that way, and knew about, the local acting scene quite a lot and the different theatres. And so it was just sort of in my blood and something I knew. And then I did do a lot of research on the old theatres that were around the place, like the Cremorne, which was more of a vaudeville place in South Bank. But even Le Boite Theatre, which I think started in the
Yeah, it's about to turn 95.
yeah, and that's a fascinating
1925.
history. And the arts theatre as well. So I just researched as much of the Brisbane theatre scene at the time as I could, and tried to incorporate that into, Gloria's backstory. So the play that she writes, the fake play, Tie My Apron Strings, would you?
It sounded plausible.
So,
It was a
I said that.
There's ballet interest in that play.
Yeah, it's supposed to be like a post-war commentary on women being forced back into the kitchen after the war. So she wrote that in the 1950s, and I thought, well, it would probably, Le Boite at the time were more interested in putting on overseas plays like You Know Cowards and the West End hits from London. They didn't do a lot of original Australian content back in the day. They do now. I had a make-believe theatrical producer, and there was a scene that I wrote that had my actress Gwendolyn meeting this producer, but the scene got cut because it didn't really fit with the structure of the novel in the 1950s, and him putting on this play for the first time. So yeah,
that's great. It's really rich, and I like that you've mirrored that with the contemporary kind of theatre scene. We've got a question from Annabelle at home who says this is her first time joining the book club. She loved your book, Melanie. After finishing the first page, she felt like reading the last page. She felt like reading it again straight away. She wants to ask, will the story continue? Will we hear about what Olivia does next, or perhaps other stories from Brisbane during this time?
Can you say that again? I just missed half of it. That's all. It froze up a little bit.
Will we hear about what Olivia does next, or perhaps other stories from Brisbane during this time?
Well, I don't know what Olivia does next. Finishes her PhD, and then gets a full-time position at a university. Yeah, good. That doesn't happen.
Great. Live happily ever after.
Yeah. I have written another short story set in Brisbane, which came out of that era, which has been shortlisted for a couple of prizes, but it's not published anywhere. And I was thinking of publishing it on my website, but I'm not quite sure. It's called The Enthusiastic Amateur. And it came out of my research from the Lock Hospital, where women were thrown into the Lock Hospital, which is in the men's jail on Bogger Road, for having venereal disease. The men weren't locked up, just the women. And, it was like a prison. So I wrote a story that came out of that. If she emails, I'll email it to you if you want to read it. I like it.
We can be your literary mediators. We can be your agents.
Yeah, so that's the only other story that I've written out of the era. And I was thinking about it at the time, but it just didn't fit in the novel. It was a completely separate kind of idea. So, yeah.
Cool. On that women's history, then, are you happy? Have you got your book handy, close to you?
I do.
One of my favourite passages in the book is Edith's view of the Battle of Brisbane. Maybe that needs some. The book explains the context, though, doesn't it? She's watching it through the windows of it. Is it the Red Cross campaign?
Yeah. So the American Red Cross was right in the corner of Creek and Adelaide Street. So there's the primary building, which is still there today. On the downstairs where the canteen was is a 7-Eleven, and upstairs on the 5th floor is the Nauru Consulate, just for your information. And then on the diagonal across from that was the Terrica building, which is not there now. It's a huge high-rise. That was the American Red Cross. So that was the recreational centre for American soldiers, white American soldiers. The African Americans had a club, which was over on the south side. So, yeah, that's where they would gather for their dances and, turkey dinners on Thanksgiving. And so the Battle of Brisbane happened on the night of Thanksgiving. And so they were in the paper the day before, there was an article about them carving up 500 turkeys for these American soldiers. So that was the starting point for this story about Edith, who's one of my female, who is a Red Cross volunteer. And there were people who witnessed it, from that Terrica building. And I decided that she goes to a bathroom window and watches it, basically. So.
Right. Well, should we hear that passage read out?
Sure. I've started it from the point where she's gone up to the bathroom, so it's not too long. So this is Edith. The thud of rocks and whatever else was being hurled against the windows and concrete was escalating, as was the hooting and shouting. She was now glad Frank hadn't promised to come to the dance, even if she'd huffed a bit about it at the time. There was no way of warning him, but surely the police or more MPs were on their way and things would be under control soon. She wanted to see for herself what was going on. The lock on the bathroom window was thick with dust and felt rusted into place. She broke a nail trying to coax it open. It eventually gave and she thrust the window up as high as it would go. Harsh noises tumbled in like the low thunder of an approaching storm, interjected with broad nasal howls of, "Come out and fight, you bastards." In the dwindling twilight, Edith could see clearly enough a crowd intent on storming the PX canteen on the ground floor of the primary building. She couldn't have said how many men there were. It could have been 500 or 1,000, perhaps more, all shouting and pelting the building with rocks, sticks, and bottles. Some were smashing windows with uprooted parking signs. There was no traffic. Even the trams had stopped running along the street. The focal point of the riot was on the Creek Street entrance to the canteen. It was cordoned off all the way around to Adelaide Street by a small squad of MPs who were holding the mob at bay with batons. She saw the MP closest to the corner take half a brick to his face. He buckled like a rag doll and was dragged into the crowd. Edith was stunned. Such unflinching brutality. She couldn't watch anymore. With her back to the wall, she inched her way down until she was sitting on the floor tiles. Her hands were shaking. She was 11 when her father had ignited in a way that made her guts feel like they were going to slither right out of her. He'd been fixing the car when he erupted without warning and threw his tools at a brick fence. He then kicked one of the tyres over and over again while shouting words that would have earned her a mouthful of soap if she so much as thought them. When he saw her sitting on the front steps, he had yelled at her to go inside. That evening, he drew her into his arms and kissed her on the forehead, but said nothing about it. The men were so angry, and in some abstract way, she knew she was part of the reason. She thought she understood something about how the world worked then, or how men made it work, and perhaps why wars happened at all. It was more confronting than if they'd all been standing out there naked. "Edith, are you in here?" The hinges creaked as Marjorie opened the door. "There you are, we've been looking for you. Are you all right? You're as white as a sheet." "Am I? Why did you run off like that?" Edith twisted the hem of her dress at her knees and shook her head. "Have you seen what's going on out there?" she asked. "Yes, I know, it's pretty scary. That's why I came to find you." The American Provost Station rang. "Some soldiers are coming to escort women from the area. They're not sure when they'll get here though, so we need..." She was cut off by the sound of 3 gunshots. Edith's heart set off like a greyhound. She sprung up to look out the window while Marjorie ran the length of the stalls to huddle in beside her. It was darker now, and the scene outside was too chaotic to get any idea how many injured or even killed. The centre of the action had moved round to the Adelaide Street entrance. From amid the fray, one man scrambled to his feet. They saw a flash of his rifle as he brought the butt down on another man's head. The man with the shotgun then sprinted towards the entrance of the PX and was pulled inside. Another MP standing by the door was yanked away by the mob and subjected to a barrage of fists and boots. Edith looked away. Holy Mary, Mother of God," said Marjorie. "The world's gone mad. Do you suppose that's what it's like on a real battlefield?" "The animals," replied Edith, with a viciousness that surprised her. Up until then, she'd felt sorry for the Aussies with their scruffy uniforms and miserly paychecks and their awkwardness around women. But right now she hated them. She was more determined than ever that Frank should ask her to marry him so she'd never have to marry one of them. Something's come over them, I'll say that much. But don't be too hard on them. They've been in some of the fiercest fighting of the war, and I'm not saying those MPs deserve to be hurt like that, but they don't do themselves any favours, the way they lord about the place, giving orders and throwing their weight around. And one of them did just fire off a shotgun. Marjorie placed a hand on Edith's shoulder. We should probably head back to the dining room, she said, though she made no effort to leave. They stayed to watch the ambulances wade through the dark swamp of olive drab. The men moved like carp around them. There was a strange lull as the medics loaded up the wounded and injured from both sides. As they left, the waning fat-bellied moon appeared above the silhouette of the Adelaide Street skyline. The crowd did not disperse, but instead drew more angry men into its ranks like fresh wood nourishing a bonfire. The humid night, heavy with dust and noise, felt peppered with gunpowder. Edith, I think we should go now. I just hope we haven't missed our chance to get out of here. Yes, right. Better close the window and pull down the blind. Edith gave the window a good yank, but it wouldn't budge. It would be easier if she could press down on it. She asked Marjorie to pass over the chair by the door. As she went to step up on the seat, her elbow swung out and knocked the talcum powder out the window. The lid fell off on its way down. The tin landed on the sheet metal awning one floor above with a resounding bang. The diaphanous cloud of white powder exploded into the strained night. Their initial shock and disbelief, mirrored in each other's wide-eyed, hand-over-mouth expressions, quickly turned into rib-pinching peals of laughter. The end.
That's great. Lots of threads to pick up on there. That cloud of white talcum dust reminded me of that other section where they're using asbestos to create the snow on the Christmas tree. Oh my God.
Well, that was, the whole chapter. They used to have chapter names, but we got rid of them in the edit. And that whole chapter was called White Powder. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And then it had allusions to racial injustices that were going on and the segregation. So, metaphor.
Brilliant. I want to pick up on a couple of those threads. A quick comment and a question from home. One of our readers says, while the book builds around the dangers for women, I found myself focused on the capabilities of women in adapting to demands, in meeting social, employment, economic demands, etc. Did it surprise you in your research how much women took on back then and now?
I think because I'd researched it earlier, I already knew that women were mobilised into the workforce. So I had two grandmothers and they were both, one was in the AWOS and the other one was in the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force. So I always grew up with this knowledge that they'd served, but I didn't understand until I was much older how revolutionary that was, that they'd even set up defence, that they were separate to the men's, but Australian Defence Force, that they could go and serve their country basically. And then you had munitions and all your textiles and canning and women were fixing aircraft and doing all sorts of things.
Yeah, and then being relegated back into the home once the blokes returned after the war finished, right?
Yeah. And some women were fine with that. They were like, it's for the duration, and that was the way it went. But not all of them were happy with that status quo. And there was a sense at the time, and Estelle Pinney brings this up in her Brisbane World War II novel called Time Out for Living, that there was this sense that something is going to change. We can work now, we've got our independence, but of course it didn't last. So
yeah great. So I'm reading comments and filtering them into you at the same time. This is just a comment from David. He says, as the characters moved around South Bank and as I recognised the finer details of that place and its surrounds, it got me thinking about the impacts of setting on readers who know an area well as compared with those who have no knowledge of the place. Somewhat like the intertextuality of a reference you don't know. You've now got me wondering how such knowledge impacts on the enjoyment of a novel. I think that opened the novel up for me, definitely, that local knowledge. He says it would be interesting to see what overseas people will think about the whales on the roof. the museum. Keep writing. A question from Bianca. She says, hi, Stephen and Mel. Hi, Bianca. Hi, Bianca.
Hello.
Thank you for hosting the book club tonight. This is her second reading of the book, Mel, and she says, I adore this book and always find reading the River Girl murder scene eerie as it takes place just down the road from where I live, near the milk factory.
Yeah, right.
Point.
Yeah.
Brilliant sense of place and time. I wonder if you could give more detail on your research process and how you were able to ensure historical accuracy. When did you know it was ready to submit to the award? And there's a little hello. Hi, Bianca. Oh, excellent. You work at Avarita. Hi.
Yeah,
I feel like I've met you, Bianca. I feel like I have.
Yeah,
Our paths will cross. Absolutely.
That's a good question. How did I know it was ready? Well, as Bianca, as you know, it was written as my doctorate. So by the time I'd submitted it for the Queensland Literary Awards, it had been through like supervisor, co-supervisor, and my examiners. And one of my examiners was just brilliant and offered some suggestions, which I then incorporated. And then I had, better readers. So, and it had been like proofread for my PhD. So there really wasn't much. There were things that needed fixing, but it got to the point where I couldn't do any more, and it was either going to resonate or it was not. And it was a tricky novel. If you've read it, you'll know that it requires you to pick up a lot of clues and and it's got a tricky structure. So it's not easy to sum up in a synopsis. It was painful. So it was like one of those things where it's either going to hit the mark or it's going to be, wide of the mark and just fall into unpublished manuscript history. But I got lucky, so yeah.
Well, we're all pleased that it didn't fall into that void. It occurred to me just while you're reading out that passage. Again, I'm thinking that I do have this kind of absorbed cultural knowledge of World War II Brisbane, maybe instinctively in a similar way to you. And I know it a little bit through literature, through David Malouf's eyes, through Jono, and also then through some of the Matt Ryan's play Brisbane that you mentioned in the novel, that Olivia mentions in the novel, or even Reg Cribb's musical with James Morrison. That was, I think it might even have been called The Battle of Brisbane, wasn't it, or something like that?
What was it called? It wasn't called The Battle of Brisbane. It was called Boundary Street.
Thank you. That's it. And so and that was very much about the servicemen and the jazz clubs. So it's never actually been through the eyes of the women that I've encountered that period until now, and really who constituted the majority local population right at that time. Can you talk more about that idea? I know you've touched on it, but that idea of viewing, maybe not just the battle, but viewing Brisbane history more generally through women's eyes, which seems to me to be the novel's overarching project.
Well, there's two things here. It's funny that you mentioned Matt Ryan's play Brisbane, which I have to say I enjoyed it. So take this bit with a grain of salt. So there was a line in the book where Olivia says, is thinking, she liked it, but she questioned once again the privileging of a 14-year-old boy's point of view. And that line got cut out in the copy edit. And I sort of regretted agreeing to it. I was like, oh no, I should have left that in. Because that's obviously David Malouf's Jono has he's also a teenage boy in the World War II. So I was just picking up on that perspective, which that novel is, and that play is, which is fine. So the female perspective actually came from my literature review, which I focused on a group of novels called that with William Hathrall defined as the ensemble homefront novel of World War II. And the most famous is Come In Spinner, which I've got this saucy edition here that you can see.
Nice.
Yeah. And then there's Soldiers' Women, which is why I'm the Xavier Herbert thing that Stephen and I were talking about earlier. and Estelle Penny's Time Out for Living. So there's 3 novels, and what they all have in common is that they have a group of sort of 4 central women and then a few peripheral women that are meant to explore different aspects of women's experiences during the war on the home front. And they're very urban based. So Come In Spinner is set in Sydney. Soldiers Women, it's not named, but it reads like Sydney. And Estelle Penny's was in Brisbane. So my novel was a deliberate response to those ensemble homefront novels. So I was writing into that tradition, but also going, what can I add from a modern perspective that I'm not just repeating those novels, because there's no point in trying to rewrite Come In Spinner. So I was very aware of this tradition of, and so I wanted to find other stories that hadn't been told in those novels, if that makes sense. And one of them was sexual violence and assault, and which was very real. And that was the things that weren't touched on in those novels, basically.
That's great. That's absolutely my next question to you. I was interested in contrasting the way that you contrasted the American and Australian men through the novel. The Australian men, was that reference? They move like tables on the dance floor. They're physically awkward and sexually inexperienced or unimaginative. They're very quick with their fists.
They didn't know how to court women, and they just did. They weren't raised in a culture where they were taught to speak to women or court them, take them out. And so the Americans brought courtship with them, which was a whole new experience for Australian women, being brought flowers and put in taxis and taken to dances, and they'd turn up the house with a box of chocolates, and this just floored Australian women because they hadn't experienced it before. So of course Australian men were just, they couldn't compete with that.
And so that's at the heart of the men, if we read the Battle of Brisbane through that lens, then it's a battle, it's a physical violence, it's a physical riot over sexual proprietorship. And
it is. So Australian men had a sense of ownership over Australian women, and here come these interlopers and, taking their women, literally taking their women, and, male pride was on the line. It was also a very misogynistic culture, and I think we still have a lot of strains of that today, let's be honest. And a macho, male posturing, I suppose. But what I've tried to make clear in the book is, which I hope comes through, is I tried not to say, the Americans were wonderful and Australians were horrible. I tried to be even-handed with that, because of course there were good Australian men, and there was some terrible Americans that were here and that comes out in the police files. There were numerous sexual assaults and rapes and terrible things that happened to women that were perpetrated by American soldiers. So
the novel certainly doesn't flinch from that. It was interesting to read the full extent of the sexual and physical violence that underpins masculinity across the board, I think, in the novel. And I guess you're saying in Western culture, I guess, or at least in those two cultures. Was that that kind of expose of the sexual and physical violence, was that an interest that you took into the project, or was that a discovery you made as part of your research?
A bit of both. I mean, something I'm quite passionate about is, violence against women, and what sparked it was, if you go to the police museum, which I think is still in Roma Street, there's a little exhibition there about a woman who was brutally beaten by an American soldier, and she died. It was horrible, and he was executed. And that kind of sparked the interest. I thought, well, that's one example, and it was quite a famous example. So I wanted to look further into that. But I have to say, I didn't really understand I read an academic article about it, but I didn't fully understand the extent of it until I went and looked at the police files myself and actually saw these, in black and white, these physical copies of what had been reported, which was very confronting at the time. So,
which has only relatively recently been accessible through.
Yeah, so the access period is 65 years. So fairly recent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. David comments again, or actually questions. He said, I was born in Brisbane in 1953 and lived there until 1967. So he's looking forward very much to reading the book. He says, my very religious mother, I learned late in life, confessed to my father having gone dancing with a Yank while Dad was stationed in Hughenden. Will the book open up more revelations for me? I'll say, yes, it will. But Melanie.
What's funny is what I absolutely loved is when I was researching the book, you go to a party or a barbecue and someone says, oh, what are you doing? Oh, well, I'm writing a book about World War II in Brisbane. And boom, somebody's got a story about an aunt that married an American, or a distant cousin that got pregnant and left, and all these, everyone's got these stories. And so, and then after the book, more stories. And I half sort of keep thinking I need to collate these and write a non-fiction book, but I don't know that I will. But there's so many stories, and there you go. There's another one. So
Yeah.
What's interesting is these are oral stories mostly, because they're not recorded in newspapers. There is stuff in newspapers, but it's these family histories and oral stories that you have to dig to find. And some of them are recorded and some of them aren't, but I'm like, tell me them. Yeah.
As well, I guess. Another reader, participant, book club member today says, I really enjoyed the document references at the start of each chapter. Yeah, I did too. And they ask, how did you match them? Was it planned or organic?
Mix and matching. I'd have one and I go, yeah, there's this is going to match this one, and then sometimes I'd swap them around until I felt that I had them in the right places. So yeah, it was a bit of mixing and matching until I felt it was right. Yeah.
They've replaced the earlier decision to have chapter headings, did they, or chapter titles?
Yeah, they had chapter titles as well, but it was just all a bit much to have a chapter title and then the epigraph and then the year. So
Gotcha.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit earlier, you referred to this theme of the control and curtailment of women's freedoms. I found that quite illuminating. I'm familiar with the notion of teachers and flight attendants and public servants, having to quit their jobs when they get married. That's a 1960s history as well, isn't it? It's quite scarily recent. But also, this idea that Vera and Val can't rent a flat without some kind of, bloke kind of vouching for them.
Yeah. It's single women.
And the girl's locked up with having VD, you just mentioned.
Yes. And Val, who's a very minor character, has I think I mentioned in there that she narrowly misses a stint in the Lock Hospital. But I would have liked to have developed Val a bit more. I felt her, but I could only have so many, or I already had a lot of female characters, so her story remained unexplored, unfortunately. But I think she would have been a hoot had I written her.
Sorry, I just checked. Oh, no, I thought I had missed a question. I haven't. I'll go on to my next one. Sorry, I'm accidentally opening up my emails to myself. Too many pots on the boil. So the research, that ground work that you did, that kind of grunt work, the footwork. I loved that description of what Lennon looked like before it was destroyed. I was pleased that the novel kind of solved that for me, because I felt like it was this hidden location that might still exist, because Lennon's Hotel, Lennon's Hotel is there now, right? But it's not the same.
No, so the next hotel is there now, and that's in the modern contemporary story, and that was refurbished from the third reiteration of Lennon's, which was moved on to Queen Street Mall, and that was built after the World War II. Lennon's was, I believe it was a Sir Joe casualty sometime in the 70s. I haven't been able to get an exact date from when it was demolished. So, but it's interesting what you say about the interiors, because there's very few photographs. However, I did eventually come across an architectural book with some photographs from when it was first built. And funnily enough, they match up to these illustrations in this brochure that was put out when it opened in 1941, with these little sketches and those descriptions that I include in the epigraphs. And that's it. That's the only, because you didn't have good lighting. So in those days, you didn't get pictures of interiors unless they were like really lit up, and that was expensive. So that's why there's a lack of interior photos, and that goes for all the buildings really. So those descriptions were priceless, I have to say.
They're great. They were really evocative, and I love the kind of decadence of it.
Yeah, I was
and the grandeur, you know, like the kind of Art Deco grandeur of it all.
I was quite thrilled when I found that brochure at the State Library. That was a, you know, like a bingo day. It was an exciting day.
A piece of sleuth work that Olivia herself would be proud of. And similarly, that scene where June and I think it's Gloria, isn't it, who meet for a drink, for a gin in the in Bellevue, the Bellevue Hotel. So that's another, you know, grand Brisbane building that Joe's mates kind of knocked down. You know, the Grollo brothers in the 70s. It's more this lost Brisbane again.
And it was impossible to. I had to guess the interiors for that, because I searched everywhere to get. I'm sure they're out there. I just couldn't find them at the time to get some descriptions of the interiors of the Bellevue. So I didn't go into too much detail. I just mentioned a Chesterfield, which in my imagination was in there. So.
And that delineation of male and female space again inside the pubs, you know, the ladies' lounges, and June's kind of apprehension of, you know, that feeling of she's very, I guess she's quite proper, isn't she? And she felt very. I enjoyed reading that you know, description of her kind of discomfort about being in that male space, and you know, that fear of almost like the fear of the principal kind of. In
the private bar,
and the kind of literary world within the novel. How did you go about discovering that? I found that quite interesting. You know, the poet, the American general who was a poet. And
well, there was this is the funny thing about Brisbane, and it's always been the funny thing about Brisbane. You know, we have this reputation of being, you know, yokels and not being cultured, but there was this really thriving, it was small, but there was this thriving literary scene, and that was started by Clinton Christensen around 1940 or 41, and he would have literary gatherings at his house. And so there's a good description of that in Judith Wright's biography, and that section of it was published in a edition of Overland in like 1981. And she describes it quite well about the American poets famous American poets that found their way, you know, looking for some literary sustenance in Brisbane, found their way to Clem's Place and the literary scene in Brisbane.
And you did Meanjin kind of the magazine Meanjin, did that develop out of that clique?
Yeah. And then it moved to Melbourne just either just before the war ended or just after.
Oh, I didn't realise it had been in Melbourne for that long. I knew it was a Melbourne magazine now.
Yeah, it wasn't in Brisbane for long, but it certainly started in Brisbane and, well, meandering, obviously. So, yeah, there's a friend of mine, Judy Powell, and her book, The Brisbane Line, came out this year. And we cover very similar territory. And she goes into the literary scene a lot more than I do, actually. And she's got Thea Astley in there and a range of other Brisbane literary characters that she brings to life. And she also has the gatherings at Clem Christensen's place. So we both struck on that. Yeah.
I'm taking a note of that. I'm quite interested. That's called The Brisbane Line, did you say? The
Brisbane Line, yeah. It's written as a crime story, and there's a lot of parallels. Very different takes, but they're almost companion novels in some ways. So
we can probably ask you now what it is that you're working on next, Melanie. Feel free to continue to shoot. We've got another 8 minutes or so before we finish up. So those of you at home, feel free to keep shooting questions in or sharing observations. But we had chatted just before we went on webinar about the next couple of projects that you're working on. So you're currently writing a play on Xavier Herbert, speaking of literary figures from the post-war Australian scene. Do you want to talk to us about that?
Yeah, well, when I was researching for Meet Me at Lennon's, as I've mentioned, Soldiers' Women was one of the books that I did literature review. And if you know Xavier Herbert's work, you know he wrote lots of books, I think about 7 novels, 2 of which were Australian classics. His first one, Capricornia, which was a big hit and was, brought him literary acclaim. And then his Magnus, Poor Fellow My Country, which won the Miles Franklin, and it's like, I don't know, 100, it's a big book, 300,000 words or something.
I haven't read it. It is on my guilty list of books.
Yeah, same. It's on the books. I don't know if I'll ever get to it. But in the middle of that, he wrote what was supposed to be his magnum opus, which was Soldiers' Women, which is just no other way of saying it is a failure of a novel. It is just terrible. I can't be nice about it, and no one can be nice about it. You read the critics, they're just scathing. Because he writes these women characters and they're just, it's a very misogynistic novel. Anyway. But what was so interesting to me when I was researching this book was from 1949. So he started writing it about 1949 and it got published in 1962. So it was like about a 13-year period in which his editor, Beatrice Davis, tried to coax this novel out of him. And their relationship was just quite extraordinary, the way it developed over 10 years. And it's all in their correspondence, which was in the archives at the Friar Library. And so I'm attempting to dramatise that relationship in a play at the moment, which is interesting and fun. Trying to convert letters into dialogue, and it's good. I'm enjoying the process, but
that's great. That I imagine the challenge there is trying to work against the static nature of literary correspondence. That it's not verbatim theatre.
No, So you've got to make these words sound like they're spoken, and sometimes it's easy. I'm finding Beatrice easy to write, and Xavier a lot harder. But we'll get there, I think.
Yeah. So with that background and that interest in theatre, how did you did that interest for you? Obviously, with your performance background, that sounds to me like it predated your prose writing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've always been interested in theatre, and I've studied acting at QT, like I said, and performed in various productions, and so. But this is the first time I'm like, right, you can write. Theatre, now you must bring them together and write a play.
So what are the muscles that have to kind of change then? So when you're moving into literary fiction writing for Meet Me at Lennon's, then I imagine then you're having to develop kind of descriptive prose muscles.
Yeah, I think
Right.
that's the difference. Everything's got to be through the dialogue, and you've also have to trust that your actors are going to pick up the subtext and, don't be too prescriptive about the way it's written, I think.
Yeah, so you've got
Is that kind of thing. So
yeah, when you go back to the theatre, then you've got to unlearn some of those prose writing habits.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I like writing
Right.
dialogue. So
And what about the next
novel?
Yes, sorry, it's cutting in and out a little. So
Yeah.
I'm having a slightly discombobulated listening experience there. Yeah, the novel, the next novel project then, because there has been, interest in our attendees' comments and threads. They're interested in more Olivia and more of wartime Brisbane, perhaps. But your next novel project is also a historical one.
Yeah, I'm switching gears to 1920s Sydney to write about the Madonna Sisters, who were these three, they were film pioneers, and they were extraordinary what they did. Paulette, Isabel, and Phyllis. So Paulette was a director and writer. Isabel acted in these films, and Phyllis was the art director and publicist. And they made their first silent film called Those Who Love in 1926, and it was a big hit. It was, and what made them so extraordinary was they deliberately weren't going to tell the Dad and Dave, the Australian bush stories, the bush range. So they just no, we're going to tell urban love stories, melodramas. So they took all their cues from American filmmaking, and they just did something completely different. And then that was a big hit. Their next film was a big hit. And then the change over to sound, they made a third film just at the cusp when sound was coming in, and it just missed the boat. And then they made a fourth film, which was their first serious film, but it just didn't kind of hit the box office. But their story is extraordinary. So I'm interviewing on Sunday the sons who are in their 80s of Isabel, who live in London, having a Zoom conference. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they can say.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I can see the parallel interests between that novel and this novel too. Again, you're looking at these forgotten creative women.
I'm just interested in women and creativity, and I think I'd gravitate towards those subjects. So
yeah.
I haven't decided how. I know there's going to be another storyline set in 1970s Sydney. So the two will, yeah.
Great. So we've got the two time periods speaking to each other again as well. Maybe to come back full circle then to contemporary Brisbane and that contemporary scene. I was interested in the mirroring that you did there, in Olivia's experience, that she's like the playwright that she's researching. She hovers around the edge of the theatrical circle. It's Cleo, really, isn't it? Who's the actor there? And like those wartime Brisbane women, it's an African American man that she's dating. And like those wartime women, her contemporary Australian lover is a kind of whilst he is an artist, he's still kind of inarticulate, physically violent.
Yeah. He was based on a couple of real life men that I've dated.
Always good to get that stuff out of your system.
Yeah.
So clearly you were consciously drawing those parallels, right? You were
yeah, absolutely.
Was it there?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you go. I just wanted to hear about that process, and what and how it, was it there always in the first draft, or was that something that you developed through your kind of relationship with your editorial team?
I think that it was always there. So I wanted to sort of make that explicit jealousy thing that was happening in the war, because I don't really show that apart from the Battle of Brisbane stuff with Edith, I don't really show it that explicitly. So I wanted to, mirror it in the contemporary scene, and make it kind of, and that idea of the interloper, which was this, encroaching on another man's territory, which is how a lot of Australian men felt. And to sort of play that out in the contemporary story, so I didn't have to do it so explicitly in the World War II stories, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, you trusted the reader, I felt, with some of the time leaps, that there's clearly, in Olivia's life particularly, there's clearly kind of, time passes and,
Yeah, she sat down to write a thesis and we just jumped to the
yeah. Well, we don't see that courtship so much, though, we just trust that it happened and then it ends. The romantic in me did kind of want that one to succeed for her and to continue, but
I know, but also I think I also wanted that thing of to show that these men went home and there were broken hearts, and they were, for the duration, they were intense and giddy and incredible. And yes, like something like 12,000, between 12 and 15,000 Australian women married American servicemen and moved.
That's a substantial number.
Yeah, and about 7,000 from Queensland. So, but for the most part, they had a wild ride for 2 or 3 years, to maybe up to 4 years, and then it was all over. So that's the story I wanted to mirror with Olivia's experience, is that he goes back and.
Yeah, it made good sense. It made sense. I came to terms with it. Interesting. This COVID lockdown period has reminded me, this long year that we're having this year, that kind of helped me, as your novel has also done, just remind me of the fact that war was 5 years long. That's 5 kind of years of the normal rules of life. That's a long time to develop meaningful relationships and friendships, and normal life was suspended for 5 times as long as it's been suspended for us right now. Interesting.
Which has gone on forever, especially if you live in Melbourne.
Oh my God. Yes, indeed. Well, they need to be reading Queensland literature to get them through there, perhaps. Melanie, that's the end of our time. We've just got 1 minute. Before I say thank you and hooroo to you, just a note to those listening and watching from home and your various devices around the place, that this will be the last book club for 2020. We're going to recommence our next book club will be on the 14th of January in 2021. And our theme, rather than polling you this time, we will go back to the voting, but this time we're going to offer the theme of summer reading. So keep an eye out for that correspondence from our engagement team here at UQ. Keep an eye out also for your survey when you log out of the session this evening. We'd really appreciate any feedback that you have about how the whole book club thing went this year. Thank you so much to all of you who've helped us with the book club. It was spawned from the dark recesses of lockdown, but it's become a project that we've really loved and do want to see continue into 2021. We hope that you do too. So let us know. Thank you very much, Melanie. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. It's been a real pleasure
having me,
discovering the book, and great. And now next time, it feels like people are hooking up here, and where our lives are all intersecting, which is what a good book club should do. So I'm really enjoying those forging those connections, and look forward to meeting you in person at some stage.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to Mary Brown, our alumni engagement officer, who helped us behind the scenes now, as always. To Olivia Brown, our school's communication and events coordinator. Thank you to Louise Corniget and all of our friends at the team at University of Queensland Press for bringing us Melanie and this novel. And thank you to Heather Zwicker, our Executive Dean, Bronwyn Lee, the head of our School of Communication and Arts, and Weston Bruner, the Director of Advancement, for kicking the can along at the very beginning and bringing us all together. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you.
All the best with the next novel. We really look forward to it. Yeah.
Better write it then. Thank you.